What really brought down the Roman Empire? Was it barbarians at the gates, a plague, or something else entirely? For centuries, we've been told a simple story: hordes of savage tribes swept in, and the mighty empire crumbled. But the real story is so much more complex and, honestly, way more interesting. So, grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's unravel the truth behind one of history's greatest collapses. First, let's get one thing straight. There wasn't a single day when Rome just fell. It wasn't like someone flipped a switch and the lights went out across the empire. The process took centuries. And it happened differently in the West than it did in the East. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, actually thrived for another 1,000 years. So when people talk about the fall of Rome, they're almost always talking about the Western Roman Empire, with its capital in Italy. The traditional date everyone learns in school is for 76 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. But that event was more like the final symptom of a very long illness, not the cause of death. To really understand what happened, we need to rewind the clock way back to the 3rd century AD. This period is known as the crisis of the 3rd century, and trust me, crisis is an understatement. It was a 50-year-long nightmare of civil war, economic collapse, and constant invasions. Emperors were rising and falling so fast it would make your head spin. We're talking more than 20 emperors in just 5 decades, and most of them met a violent end. This political instability was poison for the empire. How can you run a government when the guy in charge might be assassinated next week? The constant civil wars drained the treasury and pulled legions away from the frontiers, leaving the borders vulnerable, while the Romans were busy fighting each other. The economy was tanking, the empire was massive, and administering it was incredibly expensive. To pay for the army and a bloated bureaucracy, emperors started debasing the currency. They would mint new coins with less and less silver in them, mixing it with cheaper metals. You can imagine what this did. It caused runaway inflation. People lost faith in the money. A farmer who sold his grain for a bag of coins might find that by the time he went to the market, those coins were worthless. Trade ground to a halt. The complex network of roads that had been the lifeblood of the empire started to fall into disrepair. The rich retreated to their large, fortified country estates, called latifundia, which became self-sufficient little kingdoms. They stopped paying taxes, further starving the central government of much-needed cash. This created a huge divide between the super wealthy and the desperately poor. The middle class, the backbone of any healthy society, was virtually wiped out. Now, let's talk about the so-called barbarians, the popular images of savage and civilized hordes. But that's mostly Roman propaganda. In reality, the relationship between Rome and the Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks was complicated. For centuries, they had been trading partners, rivals, and even allies. Many barbarians actually served in the Roman army. They were skilled warriors, and Rome desperately needed manpower. Over time, the army became less Roman and more Germanic. These soldiers were often loyal to their commanders who paid them, not necessarily to an abstract idea of an empire far away in Rome. This is a huge deal. When your army's loyalty is up for grabs, you've got a serious problem. The situation got a massive shake-up in the late 4th century with the arrival of the Huns from Central Asia. The Huns were a formidable force, and their westward push created a domino effect. They displaced other tribes, like the Goths, who were then forced to seek refuge inside the Roman Empire. In 376 AD, a huge number of Goths crossed the Danube River into Roman territory. This wasn't an invasion, they were refugees fleeing the Huns. But the Romans handled the situation horribly. Corrupt local officials mistreated them, stole their supplies, and even sold their children into slavery for food. Eventually, the desperate and starving Goths revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, they delivered a crushing defeat to the Roman army and even killed the emperor, Valens. This was a turning point. It showed everyone that the Roman legions weren't invincible anymore. The empire had lost control of a large, armed group of people living within its own borders. From this point on, things spiraled downward. The empire was essentially split in two, with separate administrations for the East and West. The West was poorer, less populated, and had much longer, more difficult borders to defend. It was just weaker. Groups like the Vandals crossed a frozen Rhine River in 406 AD and rampaged through Gaul and Spain. A few decades later, in 410 AD, the Goths, under their leader Alaric, did the unthinkable. They sacked the city of Rome itself. This was a massive psychological blow. The Eternal City hadn't been captured by a foreign enemy in 800 years. Even though the city would recover, the idea of Rome's invincibility was shattered forever. The final nail in the coffin was the loss of North Africa to the Vandals in the 430s. Why was this so important? Because North Africa was the breadbasket of the Western Empire. It supplied most of the grain for the city of Rome. So what really caused the fall of Rome? It wasn't one thing. It was a perfect storm of internal and external pressures. The story of Rome's fall is a powerful lesson from history. It shows us that even the greatest civilizations are not immune to internal decay, economic mismanagement, and social division. It's a complex, fascinating, and deeply human story. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the past. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical mysteries explained. See you next time.